night was one of those rare, perfect silences. No wind to rustle the leaves, no crickets chirping in the dark. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of moss and decay. It clung to our clothes as we stood before the gates of Blackthorn Castle, staring up at the towering silhouette that loomed like a shadow against the starless sky. The castle had been abandoned for centuries, yet it felt alive. Ivy crept up its crumbling stone walls, twisting like veins, while jagged spires reached skyward, clawing at the heavens. The main gate was a wrought iron monstrosity, corroded by time, its intricate patterns warped and broken. "It looks worse than I imagined," Lily said, hugging her arms as if to ward off the cold, or perhaps her nerves. Tom, as always, tried to mask his unease with bravado. "Relax, Lily. It's just an old castle. People come here all the time for thrills." "They come here," I said, my voice lower than I intended, "but they don't stay." That much was true. The locals wouldn't even go near the place. Stories of Blackthorn Castle had been passed down through generations, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. They spoke of a ghost, a bride whose heart was broken and body betrayed. On her wedding night, she was said to have been murdered by her lover, her screams echoing through the halls long after her death. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But standing there, staring at the castle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The gates groaned as Tom pushed them open, the sound echoing into the forest like a warning. Beyond the gates, a stone path wound through overgrown bushes, leading up to the castle's front door. The path was littered with leaves that had turned brittle and black, crunching under our boots as we walked. "Why are we doing this again?" Lily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tom flashed her a grin, the beam of his flashlight catching the edge of the castle's massive wooden doors. "Because it's Halloween. And we need to do something memorable." Halloween. Of course it had to be Halloween, the one night when people felt invincible, daring fate to prove them wrong. When we reached the doors, I paused, staring at the heavy iron knocker shaped like a gargoyle's face. Its eyes seemed to glare at me, and for a moment I swore I saw them move. "You're not scared, are you?" Tom teased, already lifting the knocker. "Of course not," I lied. The sound of the knocker striking the door echoed deep within the castle, resonating like a heartbeat. We waited, holding our breath, but no answer came. After a moment, Tom pushed the door open and it swung inward with an ominous creak. Inside, the air was colder, almost suffocating in its stillness. The entryway was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Dust particles swirled in the weak beam of our flashlights, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. "Well," Tom said, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence, "we're in. Let's see what all the fuss is about." I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the broken tiles of the floor. The cold hit me like a wave, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something, a faint whisper, too soft to make out. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to the others. "Hear what?" Lily asked, already looking uneasy. Nothing," I said quickly, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. As the door swung shut behind us, with a deafening thud, I couldn't help but glance back. It felt like we'd just crossed a threshold, not just into the castle, but into something deeper, something darker. "Let's keep moving," Tom said, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. And so, we began our journey into Blackthorn Castle, not knowing that every step forward was leading us closer to the truth and to her. The door closed behind us with a resounding thud, sealing us into the castle's depths. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, thicker than I had anticipated. As my flashlight swept across the room, the beam caught a glimpse of the vast space ahead, a grand foyer, though time had not been kind to it. The floor was cracked and covered with dust, as though the castle had been frozen in a moment long forgotten. A staircase spiraled upward into the inky blackness, its steps lined with a film of dust so thick it seemed like no one had dared to set foot here in ages. The cold was immediate, biting at my skin as if the very stones of the castle exhaled a chill. A shiver ran down my spine as I took another step, the floor creaking beneath me in protest. My breath was visible in the air, sharp and white in the beam of my flashlight, but it was not the cold that unsettled me most. It was the silence. Tom, ever the skeptic, was already leading the way, his flashlight darting around in search of something to break the eerie monotony of the place. "It's just an old building," he muttered to himself, but there was a hesitation in his voice that betrayed his bravado. "A bit dusty, but nothing we can't handle." But Lily didn't seem so convinced. She clutched her coat tightly around her shoulders, her eyes wide as she slowly turned in a circle. "Do you feel that? It's like the air is heavy." I nodded, not trusting my own voice. It wasn't just the weight of the air, it was something more. Something unseen, something watching. As Tom moved ahead, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A tapestry hung on the far wall, its fabric faded and frayed at the edges. It depicted a noble woman, her face a portrait of sadness, her eyes deep and hollow. The woman in the painting seemed to stare straight at me, the intensity of her gaze unnerving. "Check this out," I said, pointing at the tapestry. Tom turned, his flashlight illuminating the painting. For a moment the light flickered, and the woman's expression seemed to shift. Her eyes, once sad, now looked almost pleading. "Creepy," Tom said, trying to mask his discomfort with humor. He reached up to touch the frame, but as his fingers brushed against it, there was a sound. A faint, scraping noise, almost as though the painting was shifting on its own. The chill in the room deepened. Lily gasped, her voice low. "Did it just... Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding. Lily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It came from over there." She pointed toward the far corner of the room where a narrow doorway led into what appeared to be a grand hallway. Tom didn't seem to notice our unease. "It's probably just the wind. Or maybe some rats scurrying around. Let's keep going." His tone was dismissive, but even he couldn't hide the wariness in his voice. He moved toward the hallway and we reluctantly followed, stepping into the darkness beyond. The hallway stretched before us, its walls lined with cobwebs and dust. As we moved deeper, my flashlight caught something on the floor. "Footprints. Someone's been here," I whispered. The prints were faint, but unmistakable. Small, delicate, almost as if a woman had walked through, her steps light but deliberate. "Someone or something," Lily said, her voice shaking now. "Just dust," Tom muttered. "Let's focus. We came here to explore." But something about the footprints unnerved me. They didn't look like ordinary marks. The ground around them was strangely untouched, as if whatever had made them had walked on air. The footprints didn't seem to leave any lasting impression in the dust. As we moved forward, my mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps someone had entered the castle before us. But the feeling was growing stronger, the sensation that we weren't alone. We came to a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. The wood was darkened with age, the grain worn smooth by time. Above it, a carving stood out, a simple but haunting image of a woman with her arms outstretched as though calling for help. Lily's voice cracked as she spoke. "Should we open it?" Tom didn't hesitate. He reached for the door's rusted handle, giving it a twist. The door groaned loudly, as if protesting the intrusion. "After you," he said, stepping back and motioning for me to go first. I pushed the door open, and the sound of it creaking echoed through the empty hall. The room beyond was massive, a dining hall filled with old, broken furniture. A long, dust-covered table stretched across the center of the room, and around it were chairs, some tipped over, some left in place, as though abandoned mid-dinner. This place must have been incredible back in the day, but as the beam of light swept across the far wall, I froze. On the wall hung another portrait. A woman, the same as the one in the tapestry, her face now twisted in agony. Beneath the painting was a phrase written in dark ink: "Do not linger where her shadow walks." Lily gasped. "What does that mean?" Before anyone could answer, a strange low sound filled the room. A faint scraping, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere behind us. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The footsteps were slow at first, deliberate. They echoed through the dining hall, bouncing off the walls and making the sound almost unbearable. Every time the footfalls landed, it was like a thudding pulse, deep and rhythmic. Tom froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Did anyone else hear that?" he whispered. His voice trembled slightly now, betraying his earlier bravado. I nodded, my throat dry. "Shh! The sound wasn't random, it was too deliberate. It sounded like someone walking, but the footsteps were coming from the far end of the room behind us. No one else was there. We hadn't seen anyone enter, and the door had been shut behind us." Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. "We need to go, now," she whispered, almost pleading. Her breath came in quick bursts, her body trembling. But Tom wasn't ready to back down yet. "It's just an old house settling," he muttered, though his eyes darted nervously around the room. He started moving toward the source of the sound, his flashlight sweeping the darkened corners. But the footsteps, they were still there, louder now, closer. I glanced back at the door. It hadn't moved. Nothing else had entered the room. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, and the atmosphere seemed to thicken around us. The temperature had dropped again, making the air seem impossibly dense, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Tom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I think we need to leave." But Tom didn't respond. He was too focused now, shining his light directly toward the far end of the room, where the shadows were deep and oppressive. A strange, cold wind seemed to stir, carrying with it the faint scent of roses, mixed with something bitter: decay. Lily's eyes were wide with terror as she backed away toward the door. "I'm not staying here," she said, her voice quivering. "This place isn't right." "Just a few more minutes," Tom insisted, still determined. He was now standing just a few feet away from an archway leading deeper into the castle, his flashlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. Suddenly, the air grew thick. I could feel it like the castle was inhaling, drawing in a deep breath that made everything seem wrong. And that's when we all heard it. Another sound. A woman's voice. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me, please." The words seemed to come from nowhere. They echoed off the walls, a soft, mournful plea. It was so real, so desperate. The voice seemed to call to us from the shadows beyond the archway. Lily's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. "Did you hear that? Oh my God! Did you hear that?" I looked at Tom, expecting him to finally realize that this was more than just an old building. But his face had gone pale, his mouth was dry, and his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. For a moment, the beam danced across the archway, catching something. A figure, moving at the edge of our vision. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice louder than I intended, but it felt necessary to break the tension. No response. Only the faintest sound of footsteps, dragging and uneven, echoing down the hallway behind the archway. The very air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if something was closing in on us. And then it happened. The candles along the walls, old, disused, flared to life. The flames flickered once, twice, and then they burned steady, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to twist and curl around the furniture, the walls, us. It was like the house itself had come alive. "Run!" Lily screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, but Tom stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. His gaze was fixed on something in the far corner, something we couldn't see. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Slowly, his hand reached out, pointing into the darkness. There it is. Before I could turn to follow his gaze, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. For a brief second, we were plunged back into total darkness. When the lights returned, the figure was gone. Lily let out a sob, clutching my arm tightly. "We need to leave. Now. We need to leave." But Tom was still staring at the spot where the figure had been. His face was ashen, his eyes unfocused. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper, trembling. "Did you see her?" Tom asked, his voice strained. "She was right there. She was watching us. I don't care," Lily snapped, pulling at my sleeve, trying to pull me toward the door. "I'm leaving. You can stay, but I'm not waiting around for some ghost to take us." The cold wind howled again, carrying the scent of roses, more pungent now, stronger than before. It was so overwhelming that I felt nauseous, my stomach churning. But despite Lily's frantic tugging, I couldn't take my eyes off Tom. His face had gone blank, his eyes locked on the same spot. "She wants something from us," he whispered, as though the thought had only just occurred to him. "She wants us to see her story, to understand." I didn't understand, but I knew one thing. We weren't leaving this place untouched. Something had woken here, and we were caught in its grasp. The footsteps continued, but they were no longer faint. They were heavy, deliberate, echoing in the silence between us. They were closer now, far too close. Lily yanked harder on my sleeve. "Please, let's go." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from somewhere deep within the castle, came a whisper, so soft and cold I felt it in my bones. "Help me." And just as quickly, the voice faded away. The air in the castle was suffocating, thick with unease. The silence that followed the last whisper was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing us from all sides. My heart was racing, and for a moment I thought I might suffocate on the dread that seemed to seep into every breath I took. Lily was already moving toward the door, her footsteps quick, desperate. But I couldn't take my eyes off Tom. He was staring at the far corner of the room again, his body rigid. His face was pale, almost ghostly, as though something invisible was draining the life from him. "Tom," I called, shaking him by the shoulder. "Come on, we need to get out of here." But Tom didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked onto something in the shadows. She's waiting for us," he muttered, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "She wants us to understand. She wants us to hear her story." "Who?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. "Who are you talking about? What story?" Before Tom could answer, something else happened. A gust of wind tore through the dining hall, rattling the windows, and the candles flickered again, casting wild shadows across the walls. In the midst of this chaos, something caught my eye, something that hadn't been there before. The portrait of the woman, the one we'd seen earlier, was no longer the same. It had changed. The sadness in her eyes had deepened, and the expression that had once been sorrowful was now one of sheer anguish, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. "What the hell is happening?" Lily's voice trembled, a mix of fear and disbelief. "Did the picture just change?" But Tom didn't hear us. He was moving toward the painting, his eyes wide, drawn in like a moth to a flame. It was as though something was pulling him toward it. "She's trying to show us," he whispered. "She's telling us what happened to her." I glanced at Lily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was already following Tom, albeit reluctantly. Something. Maybe it was the urgency in Tom's voice compelled me to follow too, though every instinct screamed at me to run. We approached the portrait, and Tom reached up, trembling, to touch the frame. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the wood, the air around us shifted again. It grew colder, impossibly cold, and the once faint scent of roses intensified. It was nauseating, cloying, like death itself was closing in. Suddenly the room seemed to tremble. The walls groaned, as though the castle itself was alive, shuddering in some ancient pain. And then, from the shadows beyond the painting, a low, guttural voice echoed through the hall. "You shouldn't have come." The words were not just heard, they were felt, vibrating through the very bones in my body. A cold, oppressive weight pressed down on me, and I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse with fear. "What do you want?" The voice responded, this time clearer, more defined. "I was once a bride, but my love betrayed me." The air in the room thickened again, the temperature dropping sharply, and I just knew that whatever we were hearing, it wasn't just a story. This wasn't some local legend. It was real. "I died in this castle," the voice continued, each word filled with sorrow and rage. "He killed me on my wedding night, and now I cannot rest." Lily gasped, clutching her arms tightly as though she were freezing. That's what they said, the woman in the stories. The bride. She was murdered by her lover." I turned to her, my heart hammering in my chest. "But how do we know this is her, that it's real?" "The portrait," Tom said quietly, his voice distant, like he was in a trance. It's her in the painting." As though responding to his words, the air shifted again, and the room seemed to shift with it. The walls faded, the floor beneath our feet seemed to dissolve, and suddenly, we weren't standing in the dining hall anymore. The space around us had transformed. We were no longer in the present day. We stood in a grand banquet hall, far grander than anything we had seen before. It was illuminated by hundreds of candles, their light dancing off the polished marble floor. The long table, now gleaming with gold and silver, was set for a feast. The castle was alive, not decayed, filled with laughter and music. But the scene was strange, distant, like something from another time. And there, standing at the far end of the room, was the woman from the portrait. She was beautiful, her face framed by flowing golden hair, her eyes wide and bright with joy. She stood beside a man in a fine suit, a man who looked at her with a tenderness that made me believe for a moment that this was a memory, a moment of happiness. Then, just as quickly, everything shifted again. The man's face twisted with fury, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. She tried to pull away, but he held her tight. The air filled with screams, and the light from the candles flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the room. "Please," the woman cried, her voice choked with fear. "You promised me, you promised." But the man's eyes were cold. "I never loved you. I only needed you." The woman collapsed, her face twisted in agony as he shoved her away. I could hear her heart-wrenching sobs as she fell to the cold, hard floor. And then there was silence. Just as quickly as the vision had appeared, it vanished. The room returned to its decayed state, the portraits back to their sorrowful state, the cold wrapping around us like a blanket of dread. Tom's voice was barely a whisper. She was betrayed. She wants us to understand. She wants justice." Lily was shaking, her face pale. "She was murdered on her wedding night. She wants us to know, to remember." And I realized then, what we were witnessing wasn't just a story. It was a plea. A ghost's desperate need to be seen, to be remembered, to make us understand the pain that had bound her to this castle for centuries. And as the shadows seemed to stretch around us, I knew we were not just trespassers. We were part of her story now. The weight of the woman's story hung in the air like a suffocating fog. The vision had faded, but the sensation of it lingered. Every corner of the room felt different now, as though the castle had transformed into something darker, more alive. The whispers of the past were no longer confined to the shadows. They were all around us, pressing against our skin, crawling under our nails, making it hard to breathe. Lily couldn't stop trembling. "We have to leave. We have to get out of here before she..." Her voice faltered, but Tom silenced her with a single look. He had moved away from the spot where the portrait hung, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond us, beyond the room, as though the castle itself was calling to him. "She doesn't want us to leave," he said, his voice hollow. "She can rest. And neither can we." Lily opened her mouth to protest, but I could see she was barely holding it together. The terror had gripped her as tightly as it had taken hold of me. I didn't want to stay here any longer, but something about Tom, his trance-like state, was enough to stop me from dragging him out of the castle. He was already too deep into whatever this was. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice strained with confusion and fear. Tom turned to face me, his eyes wide, unblinking. "She's trapped here," he said softly. "Her soul is tied to the castle, and the man who killed her, he's still here. Or something of him is." I glanced around nervously, wondering if someone was listening, watching, but there was nothing. Nothing but the deep silence that had settled like a heavy blanket over the room. The shadows seemed darker than before, their edges sharp, as if something was waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Lily didn't want to believe it, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. The stories she had heard, The warnings about the haunted castle, they weren't just stories anymore. They were real. She wants revenge, Tom continued, his voice growing colder. She wants justice, and she needs us to help her. The room seemed to grow colder with every word he spoke. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, and the wind outside howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest whispers of the woman's voice. "Please help me." It was the same voice we had heard earlier, the same haunting, desperate plea. The sound was clearer now, like the woman was standing just behind us, her breath cold against our skin. Lily looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do? How can we help her?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but I knew the answer. Deep down, I could feel it. A gnawing, insistent pull. Something was telling me that we couldn't leave until we had done what the ghost wanted. We had to find the truth. We had to uncover the full story of what had happened. "We need to find the man," I said, the words coming out in a whisper, barely audible over the sound of our collective breathing. Tom nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the shadows. "His spirit is tied to hers. He was her husband, her betrayer. He's the one who cursed this place, and now he won't let her rest." I shivered at the thought. The idea of a curse, of a spirit bound to a place, trapped in a cycle of vengeance, was something I had only read about in books. But now, it was real. It was here, with us. "Where do we find him?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How do we stop it?" Tom turned to me, his expression distant. "You don't stop it. You finish it." I felt a sudden surge of dread, like a cold hand gripping my heart. Finish it? What does that mean? Tom didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, his step slow and deliberate, as though he was being pulled by some invisible force. His flashlight flickered as he reached for the wooden door leading deeper into the castle. "He's somewhere in this castle," Tom said softly, more to himself than to us. "We need to find the place where it all ended, the place where he killed her." A sudden noise interrupted his words, a scraping sound as if something was dragging across the floor. We all turned toward the hallway beyond, where the dark shadows seemed to deepen. And then we saw it, a figure, a man standing just at the edge of the light. He was tall, his face obscured by shadows, but there was something about his presence that sent a chill through my bones. His form seemed almost vaporous, like he wasn't fully solid, like he existed in between worlds. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching us, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Lily let out a stifled scream, but Tom only stared at the figure, unblinking. "That's him," he said, his voice hollow. "The man who killed her." The figure did not respond. He simply stood there, his eyes locked onto ours, his presence oppressive, as though he were waiting for us to make the next move. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further. A cold wind swept through, carrying with it the scent of roses, the same scent we had smelled earlier. The voice of the woman returned, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me! You must help me!" The figure stepped forward, his form growing more distinct as he moved closer. The shadows seemed to cling to him, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me like a physical force. Lily recoiled, her back pressed against the wall. "What do we do now? How do we end this?" I looked at Tom. His eyes were locked onto the figure. "We finish it," he repeated, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that sent a shiver through me. "How?" I asked again, my throat dry. Tom didn't answer. He took another step toward the figure, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "We find the truth, we confront him, and we end the curse." But as he moved forward, the figure suddenly dissolved into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. The room was silent again, save for the woman's voice. "Help me!" And in that silence, I knew this wasn't over. The curse, the ghost's pain, the betrayal, it was still here, still lingering in the castle's walls. And until we uncovered the full story and set things right, we wouldn't be able to leave.